Hi, welcome to Cephalopod. My name is Cory Clark, and I am the director of the Adversarial Collaboration Project at University of Pennsylvania. And this is my co-host.
Bo Weingard, and I am an independent scholar and essayist.
Ah, nice.
Yeah.
Um, Today, Bo and I are going, well, we've been disagreeing for a while on how woke academia is really versus how woke it appears to be. Or another way to frame the question is there a sort of preference falsification problem happening in academia where academics have tendencies to portray themselves as more woke as they really are privately? But
Or also, is there a public ignorance? Is there like a collective ignorance problem?
yeah.
That is, do people in the system, as it were, think that it's more woke than it is?
Right. Before we get into that, Bo and we just lost access to our Cephalopod Twitter account, and I was just going to make a new Twitter handle for us, but Bo pointed out that no one gets Cephalopod as a podcast name, which
It's
is
a
weird because he's an
hilarious
elitist.
pun. It's a hilarious pun, but something which passes over the head of many. So
So we are rebranding as the antisocial psychologists.
also a hilarious pun.
No, you gave it away. We were supposed to pretend like there was no hidden meaning.
There's only a hidden meaning if you get it. If you don't, there's not.
So we'll probably, after we upload this episode, we'll probably eventually change our logo and name
Yes.
on the podcast and the YouTube channel. Yeah, cool. Yeah, so Bo and I have been debating this issue for I think several months. Like a good scientist, I've been collecting data on the issue, and Bo's just been naysaying me.
Like a good philosopher, I have just been speculating from the armchair.
And my feeling, a little background is I conducted like around 41 interviews with mostly psychology professors, and then as a follow-up to that, I conducted a survey. I invited around 4,600 professors to participate, and we got around 470. And my sense is that people are, I think the impression people have is that the majority of academics are these really far left people who are pro social justice everything, and they have sort of negative attitudes toward the people who are pushing for academic freedom and open inquiry at the expense of some of these social justice issues that people care about. I think that's what the impression is. I think the reality is that there's a very, very vocal minority of people who are these super pro social justice types and are the kinds who would want to shut down research, fire professors, get papers retracted, not hire people who are deserving because of their political views or whatever. But that is maybe only, you have a range of confidence, maybe like 10 to 30% of academics. And then a larger proportion of people are actually fed up with that. Maybe like, I'll say 20 to 40%. And then there are people in the middle who are kind of on the fence, but also they're really scared of the wokest among their peers. So it's not that they have strong feelings one way or another, but they're particularly terrified of this vocal minority. And so even though they would speak up against this group, they don't, because they're afraid of the repercussions for their own careers. I think that's what's happening now. And that's what my data, I think, seem to suggest.
Right. To sort of back up and set up the problem, there is a general view that academia is, I would say, radically progressive, but at minimum is pretty progressive.
I'm not sure if you cut out or if my audio cut out, but can you repeat yourself?
There's a general view that academia is progressive, it
Mm-hmm.
probably radically progressive,
Yeah.
right? Or what we will call woke. And we don't mean that necessarily in a demeaning manner, although I'm not a fan of wokeism, so-called.
Well,
So
maybe
there's,
we should define, like, when I say woke, I don't just mean like people who are on the far left who care about social justice. I mean people who are on the far left who care about social justice at the expense of like other things, and that
yeah,
they let it interfere with actual scientific progress. Um,
yeah, it's a kind of illiberal worldview that
yeah,
believes it's more important to protect victims groups than to pursue certain freedoms, freedom of
and I guess
inquiry,
like
freedom of speech,
uh,
etc.
pursue equity, and that's more important than, you know, discovering what's true about the world, or,
Or it
you
can be
know,
more important.
it
Yeah.
can be, yeah.
Yeah. So there's this view that academia is generally woke, and uh, there are many symptoms of this wokeism, such as articles getting retracted for violating certain taboos, for um, impinging upon goals of social justice or equity, and professors getting fired also for violating those taboos or for talking about taboo topics and arriving at the wrong
Mm-hmm.
conclusions about them. And the question is, what is the cause of this? Well, first of all, is this an accurate view of academia? And then,
Mm-hmm.
even if it is an accurate view, what is the cause of it? And are most professors actually woke?
Mm-hmm.
So, because I think what's important to do is separate the attitudes of individual professors from the function of academia as a group. So the salient question is, how does academia function? I don't think it's what are the attitudes of individual professors. And I'll give you an example. So if we want to understand how Walmart is going to work, it's we want to analyze it from a functional group-based perspective. That is, we don't really care what are the interests and desires of cashiers or stockers at Walmart. What we care about is what is the overall behavior of Walmart and what does Walmart, quote unquote, want.
I mean, I agree that we care about the overall behavior, but I think it's not, I don't think Walmart's a particularly good metaphor, because there you have, you know, people in positions of power, and the majority of people who work for Walmart don't have any power or say over the direction of the company. Whereas academia is, it's not a democracy necessarily, but it is much more so in that I think the individual attitudes of scientists really do have a, I mean, people vote for the leaders in professional societies. Um, the people control the journals. Everyday academics are editors and
Sure.
reviewers,
No,
and
I can see that. I'm
we
not
vote in
saying
faculty meetings for different policies. And
right. I'm not saying the analogy is perfect or it is like one to one. I'm just saying if we want to understand academia, I, I I think we should know what the beliefs of individual professors are. Of course, that's interesting and important. But I do think there can be a difference between the beliefs of most professors and the way academia functions, and that the way academia functions is the more important analytical construct here. So, um, my hypothesis is that people might be wrong about the average person who reads about woke academia may very well be wrong. And in fact, the average academic may very well be wrong about the average beliefs of the sort of modal professor.
mm-hmm.
However, I do not think they are wrong about the way academia functions as a whole. So let me
But
give you a go ahead.
no, go ahead. No, go
Okay, so
ahead.
like here's maybe a different analogy that is actually more worthwhile. So let's consider making off-color jokes. I don't know, sexually provocative jokes in one's
Mm-hmm.
classroom. Not saying that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but let's just think about that. So probably very few students would take offense to that. so let's suppose you had a classroom with 30 students, and out of the 30 students, 3 students would be offended if you made some joke, some sexually explicit joke.
Mhm.
Nevertheless, if you offended even one student and that student complained, you might get chastised for it. And in fact, you may, if you continued to do that, lose your job. Now, we could look at the beliefs of individual students, and let's say 80% of students, let's say 20% of students really liked it. They thought it was funny, it made class more entertaining. 20% of students were really offended by it, and 60% of students didn't really care either way. And then we ask a question like, what is it wise to crack a sexually explicit joke in the classroom? And how do students feel about it? Well, no, it is not wise to crack such a joke, and people would be correct to be worried about making a joke, even though the average student is not offended by it. So I think that that is what could be happening in academia.
I don't think that metaphor works either, and the reason is that the joke isn't making sexually explicit jokes isn't like the central function of
Yeah, but
teaching.
no, I
Whereas
know, but it doesn't matter.
we're talking about we're talking about the legitimacy of science. We're talking about scholars being able to pursue research questions and report data that support research questions. And this is, I think, the reason academics are really annoyed and scared is because this movement is pushing directly against what was once agreed to be the mission of science, which is the pursuit of truth. And
Right. I
so I
mean,
don't, it's not something trivial, like my whatever, I don't know, like if telling sexually explicit jokes is trivial, but it's not that important. So I don't think that metaphor quite works. And I think part of the
it,
reason, were you going to say something?
well, I just think you're missing the point, though. I agree with you that those are very different
I'm saying we
phenomena.
should have different
In
thresholds. Like maybe 10% of people are against sexually explicit
right, but
jokes, so we don't tell them because who cares? Like sexually explicit jokes
but
aren't
that's a
important.
normative claim. I'm making an analytical claim. My analytical claim is there can be a vast difference between the beliefs of the average person and
Mhm.
the way the institution behaves.
I agree with that.
That's the only claim I'm making. Then it's an empirical claim about how much that's true.
I agree with that, but I think part of the reason academia as an institution is working differently than how it would work if we were having a kind of like a majority rules system where all academics pass some kind of blind ballot on, you know, how they want these kinds of issues treated. Like, let's take any particular case when a paper's published and it has a conclusion that, you know, we don't like. It's kind of pushes up against however society is trying to progress at the moment.
Well,
People say it's
however,
harmful, it's
progressives.
problematic. Anyway, so let's just a conclusion, a socially undesirable conclusion. A
Mhm.
paper comes out.
Right.
How should that be handled? The majority of, at least of the ones I've surveyed, the majority of these are, by the way, these are psychology professors, so I shouldn't say academics. The majority of psychology professors think that scientific criticism is the only legitimate way to handle that, and we should just
Mhm.
argue against it,
Mhm.
publish a commentary or publish your own paper, collect new data, show why it's wrong.
Mhm.
That's what the vast majority of psychologists think.
Mhm.
And yet we see in increasing rates papers are getting retracted for moral and political concerns, moral concerns more really, that it causes harm to vulnerable groups.
Mhm.
And psychologists don't approve of that. If you could get everyone to vote in some kind of blind voting thing, some anonymous thing where people's views wouldn't be known, I think we would say, take the moral claims off the table. Those are not relevant. Is this, I mean, I actually think there's argument to be made that we should take moral claims into consideration. That would be a tricky issue. But as of right now, most people think that those are illegitimate concerns for a scientific paper. And if
Mhm.
people voted, we would never suppress psychological science because of moral concerns.
Okay, but
But we
let's be
do.
yeah, but I think this is going to be perplexing to somebody unless we're clear about what the disagreement is here. So we both agree that academia is woke, that it behaves as though it's woke at least, and that if you are inside academia, you might be worried that it's woke. And if you're outside of academia and you look at it, you might think academia is woke.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I also see in my data is like pretty much everyone in academia is scared of some kind of social or professional consequences if they were to share not their, you know, offensive personal beliefs publicly, but if they were to share their empirical beliefs publicly,
right. So there's
that they would be punished either professionally or socially.
Right. So there's widespread agreement that academia is woke. Now so we agree on that. The disagreement is basically like, what is the cause of the wokeness in academia? And would academia be less woke if other professors knew people's actual beliefs? That's the question, right? Because I think it would still be woke, because I think it functions as an institution and it's different in some sense. We have to analyze it differently than we would analyze the beliefs of the average person in the institution.
I think part of the reason it is perceived as woke and it functions as a woke institution, maybe we shouldn't be saying woke, I don't know what we want to call it, but
let's call it progressive.
It's a far extreme progressive or something.
Right, very progressive.
I don't want to alienate like reasonable left-wing people. I'm talking about like extreme, far left. I think part of the reason it operates that way is precisely because there's a preference falsification problem, and that people are creating the false impression that there's a consensus that this is the direction we should be headed in. But most people don't think that. And the illusion of that consensus is what scares people away from stating what they really think. So it's operating that way because of an illusion of a consensus that does not exist. And it's just a problem that continues to like perpetuate itself because once some people are too scared to speak up, fewer people are going to. Those people then get punished by the sort of vocal minority on the other end, terrifying people further, which creates even greater illusion of consensus. I should say part of this is like, I haven't analyzed all of my data yet, but one thing we see is a strong correlation between the extent to which professors endorse taboo beliefs, like conclusions in the social sciences that are considered taboo. A lot of these would be like genetic explanations for group differences. People who think that group differences are genetically caused are much more likely to self-censor their own beliefs. So there's this sort of asymmetry where one side of the spectrum is willing and happy to vocalize their views, to call out other people, and the other side is just staying quiet. And that gives the vocal side more power. And I mean, they've been really successful, I think, at creating the illusion that everyone's on their side when I think most people are actually against them.
Okay, so I don't doubt that pluralistic ignorance plays some role in the behavior of non-woke professors, and I don't doubt that it does encourage or promote some self-censorship. But my contention is that the self-censorship and the refraining from talking about one's own empirical views, especially if they are taboo, I think that that's rational. It's a rational response to the way that academia treats people. And
I think it's selfish.
Well, it can be rational and selfish, right?
That's true.
Rationality
often
doesn't
being rational.
Yeah, exactly. Rationality says nothing about whether it's altruistic or selfish. Point is that academia actually functions as a woke institution. I was fired, other people have been fired, people have had articles retracted, and many people self-censor
Mm.
quite intelligently so. So the question is that because they are ignorant of other professors' beliefs? Or is it because they know what would actually happen to them if they didn't self-censor?
It's I think of it as a collective action problem. I think if everyone simultaneously would say the way they feel about these issues, we couldn't possibly have the severe consequences that there are now when only a handful of people will speak up. This is why I think it's kind of selfish, and I don't want to like throw people under the bus too much, because I appreciate all of the people who talk to me and tell me what they're really thinking, and they won't say so publicly. This has contributed to my knowledge on the topic, so I appreciate it. But on the other hand, the fact that all of these people feel this way and won't say so publicly just makes it harder for other people to speak up too, and allows this state of affairs to continue where you have this, what I really do believe is a vocal minority having a lot of power over the direction that academia is headed in. Relocated.
Okay, I don't remember what the
I was saying how it's a collective action problem, and
Mhm.
if everyone would speak up together, then I think things could change quite rapidly. But because so many people stay quiet, only like a handful of the bold will say anything, and
Mhm.
they get punished because it looks like, oh, there's only 100 bad apples. So we can get rid of all of them. But if it's
Right.
70% are bad apples, well, maybe they're not as bad as we thought.
So I think that that's a complicated hypothesis because, for example, let's just take the Walmart analogy, even though you don't think it's a particularly good analogy, but let's use it here. Suppose that 80% of Walmart employees, including 80% of the management, wanted Walmart to behave differently. Would it behave differently? And the answer, if they really wanted it to, and they work together, yes, then it would behave differently. So I agree that if 80% of academics or even 60% all got together and said, we don't want it to work this way, we're going to collaborate to make sure that it works a different way, it would work a different way. I guess my claim would be not enough academics care enough to make it different.
I
Right?
disagree.
And I
I
don't
think they
think it's
care. I just
ignorance
think they're
that's causing.
scared.
No. I think it's not ignorance that's causing this, right? I mean, I agree that there is some ignorance, right? So I don't think people would guess accurately what the average professor's views are, or maybe they would think that the average professor is a little bit more supportive of draconian punishments for
I
those
think they
people who
would
espouse.
drastically overestimate the percentage of people who
Mhm.
feel that
maybe,
way.
maybe they would, but I find the claim that actually the majority of professors don't want academia to work the way it does, but it works the way it does, implausible. It's a very implausible view. I think most
I don't think it's
academics are
implausible.
perfectly content with what's happening in academia. There is, in fact, a subset of academics who don't like it and they complain about it. They complain about it both publicly and privately. But my guess is the majority of academics are not that disgruntled by what's happening in academia.
I think they are, and I don't think it's apathy. I think it's fear that
Mhm.
is preventing them from speaking up. These people, they've worked like it becoming an academic is it's a really big commitment, Like
Mhm.
you spend whatever time in grad school, the job market's a huge pain in the ass, you move around, you get paid garbage. Like
Mhm.
people work really hard and invest a lot of time and energy into this thing. And once there are plenty of other things you can do if you're a psychology PhD. Although there weren't always a ton of other
Right,
things you
but
could do. And so it feels like getting booted out of academia, or becoming not even booted out, but just being like widely disliked by your peers. That
mhm.
is that is a really, really negative outcome for people. Like they
Right,
would
but why would you
really
be
want to avoid that.
widely why would you be widely disliked among your peers if most of your peers actually agree with
Because
you?
people don't know that. People don't know their peers agree
No,
with
no,
them.
I know, but
They
you still,
I
let's
have
say,
people talking to me like about each other, thinking the other person is like the super woke person, and I know that they're both not, and they're
dude,
scared of each other.
let,
They would be friends if they would
okay,
just like be honest to each other.
let's make a concrete example to think this through. So let's suppose that we have a professor at Harvard, and that professor at Harvard writes a paper. And in that paper, he contends that we shouldn't worry about STEM disparities because the cause of STEM disparities is not prejudice or bias in the system. It's not
Mhm.
widespread misogyny or ubiquitous sexism. Rather, it's intrinsic differences in men and women, mostly not cognitive ability differences, but rather differences in preferences.
Mhm.
Men prefer to work with things, women prefer to work with people. Now let's suppose
Mhm.
that there is this professor and he wrote this. Let's not even we not only should we not worry about it, he or she might say, but in fact we should applaud it because it means that people are choosing occupations that they like. Now, my claim would be that that person would be widely despised by his and her peer or her peers and would face massive and very unpleasant consequences.
I think if
Now,
you
I,
take 20% of academics who, I'll use that as my estimate of the people who are driving the charge toward, equity over science, I suppose.
mhm,
Um, if you take 20% of academics and you get them all to go on Twitter and denounce this person or sign a
mhm,
petition, you're going to have thousands of people denouncing this person. It's going to
mhm.
look like a lot of people. What you don't see is the many more thousands who aren't saying anything because they don't want to be the next person with the target on their back. They
Right, but
think it's wrong, but they won't say so because they're literally watching this public, shaming happening, and they
mhm,
think if I stand up for this guy, I'm next.
but
Uh,
they don't care as
and it's
much.
not that, no, they do care. I mean, not all of
No,
them.
they
I
don't.
don't imply that they all care. But a lot of them do care. And
Oh,
I
but
would
that's a
guess
different question. I said care. They don't care as much. I agree
as
that
as much
they
as what? As much as
so let's suppose that you're right and it's 20% of people would find this professor repugnant and would want to
mhm,
denounce the professor. And let's even say that the other 80% are happy that the professor, even if they don't agree with the professor, they're happy that the professor made those claims and arguments and they would just like to have judicious debate about it. If the 20% care, let's say an 8 out of 10, and the other 80% care, let's say a 3 out of 10, they might lose anyway. Even if you added up all the care on like, if you imagine some sort of scale and you add the care, it may be that their care doesn't triumph over the care of the zealous and ardent minority. And that's what I'm saying is that if you have this ardent minority, they may affect the behavior of the institution more, but that behavior from the analytical perspective, from the construct of the institution, that's very real. There's nothing illusory about that. That's real institutional behavior, and that matters.
but I think you are underestimating how much people care. I agree that there is a
Mm-hmm.
group of people who I would call these, I mean, you almost could call them like kind of nuanced people. They just they see all these things as really complicated issues. They think, yeah, like we need academic freedom and we should have open inquiry. Scientists should be able to report data, but I understand like maybe we should consider potential harms and the truth might not always be better. Those people, I would say, it's not that they don't care, but they see these issues as relatively complex. But there is a, I believe, larger group of people who care a lot, and they are opposed to the 20% of the woke. And I'll give an example of one of the questions we asked in our survey. I think it was, what do you think of, it was something along the lines of, what do you think of scholars who start petitions or Twitter campaigns to get papers retracted for moral reasons? They cite moral concerns, like these results could harm, or they could like affirm stereotypes of vulnerable groups or something like that. The modal response on a 100-point sliding scale from maximum contempt to maximum admiration and respect, the modal response was 0, maximum contempt. There were almost no people who had maximum admiration and respect. There were a lot of people on the fence, like right up the middle, but most people were on the lower end of the scale. Most people dislike these people, and a lot of people hate them, like hate them. And so you don't, to my view of academia, not looking at these data, is people are totally down with these people who start these petitions and Twitter campaigns. They don't dislike them, and more people support them than oppose them. But I think no, way more people oppose them. It's just those are the people who stay quiet. Again, because not because they don't care, but because they're afraid, because they have everything to lose. This is their whole life, their whole career, the whole investment they've made in their career.
If
could be lost.
Let me ask this then. If your contention is true, then why doesn't academia work the opposite way? That is to say, why isn't it the case that those who attempt to thwart academic freedom and attempt to curtail free inquiry are denounced, derogated, insulted, humiliated, maybe even fired? And those who promote academic freedom and inquiry, why aren't they lauded and given jobs at Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Stanford? Right?
I mean, that's a good question.
Explain that to me, and I think that the answer.
Do I have to?
Well, if you're going to make
I think it's been a slow change. I think it's been happening over
what
decades.
Happened to Arthur Jensen in the 60s?
I'm told it was pretty unpleasant.
Right. I agree with you that it's been a slow change, but I don't think that even the 70s were a paradise of academic freedom.
No,
at least specifically when considering taboo claims about group differences.
There were particular things that have become more sensitive over time. And I suspect those became sensitive. Oh, I think this earbud just turned off. Or did it just turn on? Will you say something?
Yeah.
Ah, shit. Now I'm gonna have to do 2 cuts.
Okay, so you're making this claim about gradually changing academia.
Yeah, I think issues, they become sensitive, and then, I mean, things like race and gender have been sensitive for a really long time. Those are the things that are still really sensitive right now.
Yes.
But I think as more people have gotten on board with being sensitive about these issues, it starts to affect other areas. Like, I don't know at what point pretty much everyone was on board with, let's not discriminate on the basis of race or gender on anything important, like hiring decisions or like criminal justice decisions, those kinds of things. I don't know at what point everyone got on board with that. But once you have that, the sensitivity can start affecting other areas of decision making. And at some point, it might start to affect decision making in the realm of science, in terms of like, what questions should we even be allowed to ask? What questions should we be allowed to report data on? And I don't know exactly when I don't think we had academic freedom ever. I think the issues we didn't have academic freedom about probably have changed a little bit over time. For
Mhm.
example, I
I
suspect
agree.
people who studied sex received a lot more pushback, 50, 70 years ago, whereas now sex is pretty much not taboo at all anymore. You can
Right.
say just about anything you want.
Right.
So it's changed.
Yeah.
But I
Kinsey
think
would
it's,
not be shocking to our sensibilities.
no,
Right.
people love that shit now.
Right.
Yeah. Um, so I mean, to answer your question, I guess I don't know. There's no point in time when it happened. It's been a slow change. Um,
Okay, but do you
have
think
people
that it
ever
would be
been admired for supporting academic freedom? Yeah, I mean, some people still are.
right? But this is my point: is
John
that
Haidt is beloved by many,
right? But my point is that
disliked by others, but
it's just objectively the case that the Harvard professor who made the claim that genes were partially causally responsible for, say, group differences
mhm,
would that would tank, absolutely obliterate his or her career, just annihilation, poof,
most
gone.
likely.
Okay, now then the question we're asking is, why would it do that? And what you're saying is, if I understand you correctly, is that the reason it would do that is because there is this small minority, maybe even like a larger minority, but definitely a minority of zealots, say
Mhm,
10 to 20% of people who attempt to enforce their ideology through derogation, public shaming, and professional career consequences, up to and including firing if they can,
mhm,
right,
mhm,
and article retraction.
mhm,
Okay, and that actually the majority of people don't like those people,
mhm.
and they like academic freedom and they support academic freedom strongly, but somehow they always lose to this minority because they're ignorant. And I find that incredibly implausible.
Because they're ignorant and fearful.
Right, but
I would
if
say,
if if you,
like, not many people would be uh, supportive of a scientist who wanted to like assert that there were genetic causes for group differences. Most people would think that person was wrong,
Mhm.
um, but most people would still support his right or her right to test those questions and report those data, even though they wouldn't like the conclusions or agree with
Okay,
the conclusions.
so I agree. Let's be like
They
clear
wouldn't
about our
want to see that person fired, I don't
right,
think.
but let's be clear about the claims that we're making, because
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you. I think privately the majority of professors do not think that, let's call it a guy, let's just make it John Doe. John
Mm-hmm.
Doe claims genes are partially responsible for group differences. I agree with you that the majority of professors would not want John Doe fired, and in fact the majority would claim that they support his academic freedom to publish those ideas and have that debate. I think there's a minority,
Privately.
privately they would
Yeah.
say that, yes. I think there's a ardent minority of flamethrowers
Mm-hmm.
who would want to torch John Doe's
Mm-hmm.
career and would do everything in their power to do so. So let's say
Yeah.
that's 10 to 20%.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my claim is that the reason the institution acts the way it does is because that 10 to 20%, they care a heck of a lot more than the other people. And because of that, they have much more influence over how the institution works. And in fact, many of the people who privately would support John Doe's academic freedom probably are reluctant about those ideas. And they're like, I'm not too sure about it. So it's not that big of a deal to me if John Doe gets in trouble for what he's saying. That's my claim. That's my
I
hypothesis.
agree that the vocal minority cares a lot, and they are happy to, out themselves as members of that vocal minority and
Yes.
sign whatever petitions and tweet
Right.
about it. Um,
They are
because they don't have
enthusiastically,
anything to fear.
right. They're
Um,
proud of it.
they are, they are.
Yeah.
And people on the other side are more, so there's, on the one hand, you have the conflict where these are people who do support academic freedom, but also disagree with a lot of the ideas they would support academic freedom for.
Yes. Right.
So it's not like all of their beliefs and views are perfectly coherent and pleasant. It's not like
Right.
supporting academic freedom doesn't always feel good,
Right.
because that means that you have to support academic freedom for things that you think are wrong or
Right.
even maybe morally questionable. Um,
Right.
so that's a problem. Um, but I, I mean, maybe we're not fully disagreeing. Maybe we're just disagreeing on kind of like the degrees of this. So I think depending on the issue, academics who do care about academic freedom will care more or less about it in particular cases.
Oh, I agree with
And
that.
in like the cases that most conflict with their own beliefs, they probably are a little bit less supportive.
Right. So
But
let's,
also in those cases, because it conflicts with their beliefs, the majority of people actually do like take, I mean, we would have to look at a particular like genetic contribution to some group difference, but like the majority of people disagree with that, then defending that scholar creates the impression that not only are they supporting academic freedom, but they're supporting an idea that most people think is wrong.
I don't think that's right. So let me give you a different concrete example to see what you think about it. So
Okay.
imagine that there's a professor at Harvard who openly advocates libertarian economic policies. He,
Mm-hmm.
again, we'll call him, no, we'll call it's a she, Jane Doe. So
Okay.
Jane Doe is a social psychologist who's a very well-known libertarian,
Mm-hmm.
right? Jane Doe gets fired.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I will guarantee you, if Jane Doe got fired simply for advocating, say, 10% tax rates, there would be a massive cacophony of complaint about that. And the reason there would be is because at that point, the majority of people who support academic freedom, tepidly in other cases, would support it blazingly, right? They would be white hot in support
But
for it.
doesn't that
And
show
there,
you that it's fear? Because
no,
it's
it doesn't. It
particularly for
shows
these
you that
taboo
it's care.
areas.
It shows you it's how much do they care. So in
But
this,
why would if people care about academic freedom, why would they care a lot in that case and not in the case of like a genuinely taboo belief or
because
empirical conclusion rather?
because I think a lot of these people who would be incandescent with rage if Jane Doe got fired for her
Mm-hmm.
libertarian beliefs, even if they strongly disagreed with libertarianism.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of John Doe, they actually think maybe John Doe's going a little bit too far, and maybe that's not something they do want to promote. And at any rate, it's not that important to them if John Doe's in academia. Whereas they would be,
Yeah, but this is confounded with like how taboo the conclusion is and how much trouble you would get in for supporting it. Like, I agree. I think probably most academics aren't libertarians, but no one really
definitely,
cares about it. Like, no one is
I
offended by
agree.
libertarianism.
I agree.
Um,
Well,
it's
no, no,
not a
no.
sensitive
Some people
issue.
are.
Maybe some people, but
Okay,
most
well,
people aren't. It's not a
take a
sensitive
different.
issue. It's
Oh,
like if someone
well,
said
no,
like,
right, but issues are taboo because people care about them, and that's my point. Is that the zealous flamethrowers care a lot more than the other people, and when they do care a lot more, you get the institution
there,
behaves in ways that reflect that.
but there's another side to this, which is that if people are supporting academic freedom
Hmm.
and they're trying to defend academic freedom, what
Hmm.
is the worst they can do to someone who's trying to interfere with academic freedom? They can say, I disagree with you.
You could
They
fire the
can't,
person.
no, you can't,
Why
because
not?
they should be free to argue against academic freedom. They should be free to oppose
No,
certain
that's
kinds of research.
that's like a Popper's paradox thing. Like supporting
I think the
academic
people who
freedom
support
doesn't mean
academic freedom, now I know there are like certain people, and I think particularly people outside of academic freedom who are like pro academic freedom people, and they'll support firing people who challenge academic freedom. But most people in academia that I know that are pro academic freedom would never petition to get someone fired, pretty much no matter what, and
I'm not
except for things like, you know, like having sex with your students, like things that are
right. I'm not saying they would. I'm not making it. I'm not even making a normative claim. Although I would say an institution doesn't have to have people in it who violate the norms of the institution. So I don't think it's a violation of academic freedom to fire somebody who's attempting to undermine that very norm.
Whether you personally think that or not, I do
Right.
think that it would look hypocritical for people who defend academic freedom to try to fire people for challenging academic freedom. And so
I
I
don't
think
think it
they
would look
won't do it.
hypocritical at all.
And so, well, maybe you don't think so, but I think that would be the concern. And I think that's why people don't do it. So it's really like people who are bringing bombs and people who are like, no, don't do that.
Okay, but then again, why is it that we both agree that in the case of Jane Doe's firing, there would be massive outpouring of anger and righteous essays about how it was morally despicable for Harvard or whatever university to fire her? You agree with that, right? Whereas if you got fired because you said that genes play a partial role in group differences in, say, cognitive ability or something, you would not have that. That's my point.
Yeah, but there's a confound here. Well, there are several confounds. One is like, how much do people think the conclusion is false? I mean, libertarianism is
Sure.
almost more of an opinion than an empirical conclusion.
Okay, but you know that I can make an opinion that would get somebody fired and nobody would defend it.
Yeah, but I'm saying
Okay.
I'm saying that these are all confounded with multiple things. One is, how much does defending this idea put a target on my back? Of course, anything that's more taboo, people are going to be more terrified to defend.
I agree with
Now,
that,
I
but
could imagine the most like the strongest proponent for academic freedom might not support like certain kinds of empirical conclusions, like, you know, like I guess anything defending pedophilia is not is pretty much universally frowned upon, and I don't think many people would stand up to defend someone who did defend that. So I agree with you that like one reason people don't stand up for academic freedom is because they don't care, especially in particular cases where they're like, not only is this empirically wrong and we've known it forever, but it's also harmful. But there is a confound there, which is also how much trouble could I get in for defending academic freedom in this particular case.
I agree with that,
I'm not
but
saying like, I'm saying in different cases people will have different reasons. My only argument is that there is a substantial group of academics who would defend certain research agendas and certain researchers who don't, because of two reasons. One, they're afraid of the vocal minority, and two, they think the vocal minority is actually a majority, and I'm saying it's not a majority.
Okay, so that's
but I'm not saying that there aren't other reasons that people, even someone who says I'm pro academic freedom, certainly there would be cases where a scholar would do something or say something where you might be like, okay, well, you know, draw the line somewhere.
So I think that's helpful. So let's take your two reasons, and because my claim is that it's mostly reason one is more motivating than reason two. So I don't think I agree with you. Again, to be clear, I do think there is some pluralistic ignorance. I do think professors are unaware of the opinions of other professors, and probably they're unaware of how supportive of academic freedom a lot of professors would be. I agree with that. I don't, however, think that that's much of the motivator for this. I think the motivator is, as you said, because they're afraid of what would happen to them, which is very real. And also, I think they actually sniff the unsavoriness of the idea, and they're like, I don't actually know if I care enough to defend this, right?
Oh
So
yeah. I
you
mean, I
could
think
imagine, for
that's a
example,
big part of
somebody,
it is
yeah,
that
so imagine somebody who's like ACLU, well, what ACLU used to be, like a civil
mhm,
libertarian,
fire.
maybe, yeah, maybe would be reluctant to say, to champion the cause of a confessed child killer, right? Might think, you really need defense rights. I advocate for the defense, but you know what, this person killed 32 children. I'm not really sure that I want to go public and advocate for that person's defense. I think that is a lot of what's going on. And I don't think I think even if people knew the views of 70 to 80% of professors were roughly pro academic freedom, it wouldn't change people's behavior.
I think it wouldn't change their behavior in certain cases, but I think it would change their behavior in others. And I think it would change their like okay, it could actually change a little bit of what people are willing to study if they knew that a lot of their peers wouldn't hate them for studying certain things. But at minimum, I think it would change who they're willing to support and what topics they're willing to support. And even pushing back against like certain policies that are changing, like in journals where we'll consider potential harms in our decisions to publish, or we'll consult with the group that this research is about before we agree to publish anything. I think people would be more willing to push back on those kind of broad, abstract issues surrounding academic freedom, even if they weren't willing to support certain scholars who really did cross a line. And I think what you have is you have an asymmetry in that there are, I mean, it's possible that I have like a biased perception of this. I was going to say, I don't think there are really consequences for the scholars who try to get other scholars fired. Now, I do think there are social consequences. I would be willing to bet anyone who is willing to lead the charge against these academics. I'm sure plenty of people say nasty things to them. So that can be hard. I don't want to downplay that. But are there institutional consequences for these people?
No,
I
there
don't
aren't.
think so.
Right, I
So
agree.
these people are taking almost no risk at all by attacking one of their peers,
Right.
whereas you really are taking a risk when you
Yeah, I
defend one of
agree.
your peers.
I
And
agree.
so there's a there's a there's a like one group can kind of be extreme, and maybe even in cases where they're not sure if this person should be fired, support
Yeah.
it because who cares, nothing bad's going to happen to me if I support this. Whereas on the other end, you might say, oh, I really do support this person, but I can't do so publicly. And I'm sure you're probably aware of this more than anyone, that there are people who support you who would never say so publicly. And that asymmetry inevitably creates a sort of biased perception of what is the truly socially costly position to hold. So these people,
No, but that step there is an illegitimate step. So I agree that there's this asymmetry. We both agree about this. And we both agree that those who would explicitly argue that you should besmirch the professional reputation of somebody who forwards views that are scientifically argued but taboo, that's a minority who thinks you should engage in that kind of behavior. In fact, it's probably a substantial
it's a
minority.
minority that people think that you should like do ad hominem attacks against people
Yes,
who, okay,
yes, that I think it's a
yeah, that's probably
substantial
true.
minority. However, it is just objectively the case that the institution punishes people who forward taboo ideas, and that asymmetry is real, and it's not a bias for me to recognize that asymmetry and to behave accordingly. That's what
I
I'm saying.
I no, so I'm not saying that it's a bias to
Right. So what's the
react
bias?
to the perceived. No, I was saying that I might be biased and that I might
No, you
underappreciate.
you made this leap from there's this asymmetry, and then you said, therefore, people are biased about their views of something. And I'm saying they're not biased. They're actually responding to real incentives.
No. So I agree with you that they're responding to real incentives as they exist now, based on popular perceptions of what people think about these issues. I'm saying those popular perceptions are wrong,
right? So
and that they would change if we got really clear, better data on what people thought about these issues. And I think the institutions themselves might become a little bit, I don't want to say bolder, but I think they would swing back a little bit more toward the academic freedom side if they realized, 85% of our faculty think that scholars should never be fired for drawing like socially undesirable research conclusions in papers that report data. I think if they knew that, they wouldn't take these petitions as seriously as they do now. Now they take them very seriously.
I think this is,
and they almost always feel like they have to take some kind of action if there's a petition against one of their.
To me, this would be like saying, if this politician who keeps winning these elections actually knew that most people have a negative opinion of him or her, he or she would change his or her behavior. No, because the incentive that matters for a politician is not how well liked are you, it is, do you win the election, right?
But
similarly,
I'm talking about
incentive that matters for a professor or for a journal is what materially and reputationally happens to you when you do something.
But what I'm saying is, if everyone knew the way everyone else felt, then more people would be willing to speak up on the other side. More people would be willing to say, no, we need to get the people who are interfering with academic freedom out. Those people are the people who don't belong. And then it becomes costly to be those people, which right now it's not costly at all. And then more people on the defending side. So I know if I study a taboo, if I make some kind of empirical conclusion that people aren't going to like, if I know, hey, 85% of my peers have my back, 10% are going to hate me, okay. I think if people were more aware of that, the incentives would change. And that's kind of the point of this exploration is if we can show people that their peers aren't on the side that they think they are, then that should give people more courage to be willing to share their own views on these issues publicly, which then change the incentives, and then the majority actually could be victorious.
So I think that this is like the fantasy of the politician who tells the truth.
I'm a dreamer.
Yeah. I think you and John Lennon are dreamers, and the hard-headed realist just looks at the behavior of the institution and is pretty skeptical about what would happen if people knew the private beliefs of individuals. So I bet if you gave people...
Well, it would have to be private beliefs that are turned into action. You still have a collective action problem. Even if I knew 85% of people are on my side, but I knew only 5% are going to say so publicly, then what good is it having 85% of people on my side? But people need to come together and,
Right, but the really important thing is the asymmetry in concern about these things. So if you imagine being in a faculty meeting and suppose that you can say something that 80% of people will agree with, but 20% of people will absolutely abhor. Or you can say something that 30% of people will agree with, but everybody else will be pretty indifferent to. Well,
this is reminding me of the time at Durham where we tried to vote to change the menu to vegetarian. The people who wanted the sausage rolls really wanted the sausage rolls, and there were only like 5 of them. But God damn it, they want those sausage rolls.
Right, and you can see.
And so we didn't move to a vegetarian menu.
Right, and in groups are not the behavior of an institution. Actually, this is often good, I think, by the way. the behavior of an institution is not determined by the modal belief of the person in the institution. It's determined by the amount of care and concern people have and certain kinds of norms, etc. But
that's really, I mean, I agree with you that that's how things work a lot of the time, but I don't think that's the optimal way things should work. But that just means the person who throws the biggest fit has the most power.
Okay, but like, let me give you an example where this is good.
Like I could throw a bigger fit.
Right. No, I agree. You kind of get like the
I could try to get people fired.
Right. The proverbial heckler's veto, right? The person who cares and shouts a lot, shuts everything down. Yeah. That can be a problem.
And ruins it for everyone.
Right. But there are lots of things for which the minority view is actually the better view. And it's good that society, that the behavior of the institution is determined by the minority view. Take, for example, the criminal justice system. I suspect that the majority of people would like to torture and absolutely lacerate, say, a child killer, would want him to face much greater punishment than he does. A lot of these things, freedom of speech, for example, a lot of these like things that came out of the Enlightenment, they were promoted and championed by a minority of people.
Yeah, but I think probably those minorities, we want them to win when they win via persuasion of other people and not when they terrify other people into silence.
Terrifying people is a variant of persuasion.
What is more persuasive? Sure. I mean, you're persuading people to comply, but you're not persuading them to get on board with whatever your philosophy or mission.
Sure. So these are difficult normative questions. I guess the empirical claim that I'm making.
Certainly, it's not always true that you want the minority calling the shots. And probably more often you don't, but sometimes obviously you do.
Yeah, I don't know how to adjudicate that. It's complicated. I'm not claiming that the minority should always call the shots, of course. I'm just saying that my empirical claim here is that the woke behavior of academia is not primarily propelled by pluralistic ignorance. It's propelled by the outsized influence of an ardent minority. And the reason that ardent minority has an outsized influence, and the reason that there is this asymmetry, is because they care more. And I don't think much would change. So let's say we say, hey, turns out 80% of people champion absolute freedom of inquiry. Mm-hmm. Okay, if those 20% are willing to throw a bigger fit, get people fired, damage their reputations, etc., that doesn't matter. The only thing that would change that is if the 80% started to care more.
I agree that if the 80% cared more, that would help. But I also think that there is, I also think that if people were more aware of the majority opinion, then their fear would decrease a little bit. And then that could be the thing that motivates more people to speak up, and more people speaking up inevitably motivates other people to speak up. And it deals with, to some degree, the fear issue. Now, I'm not saying fear is the only reason people don't defend academic freedom, but I do think it is a big reason. Do I want to say it's the biggest reason? Because I don't know how we would empirically test it, I'll say yes. I think it's the biggest reason is people are afraid of this vocal minority who will go after people who defend academic freedom with everything they've got and not even have any concern for proportionate punishment for publishing a taboo research. It's your career should be over and no one ever should hire you again.
Yeah, I think fear, I agree with you that fear, it might be the chief motivator or the chief deterrent here. I guess I would just ask to imagine this hypothetical faculty meeting again. And again, just think about, suppose that you want to say something, you don't care that much about it, but you do believe it. right? Like, say you believe, let's just let's just make this weird world in which people get really exercised about soda. And so there's a debate about should there be soda in the machines. And there's been a movement to replace all soda with water because of concerns with obesity. And let's say that 10% of people really care about this issue and they think it's an abomination to put soda in the machines. And let's suppose that but let's suppose most other people think, it should be up to individuals, buy what you want, but not a big deal. Now, suppose that you think, I think if you want to buy an A&W root beer, you should be able to, but I don't care that much. And you could say, I think we should put soda in the machines. Most people would agree with you, but 10% of people would really hate you for that. And maybe 1% of them would attempt to assault you physically. Okay, you can see
It's
what
a
would
good
happen.
reason to assault someone.
Even if you knew how many people agreed with you, even if you knew, look, most people agree with me, and I could find these people and we could talk about it rationally, it would be perfectly reasonable for you to avoid saying that, given the outsized concern of the 10% of people who think it's a morally righteous crusade.
But don't you think the sort of mature solution there would be, let's say it's a faculty of 40 people, so there are 4 people who really want to get rid of the soda. Say, okay, you 4 present your case to the rest of us and then we'll take a vote. And they can either persuade them or not.
Well, yeah, that's a normative claim, and that's.
But that just seems like pretty reasonable to me, rather than like let these 4 scream at the top of their lungs for the entire faculty meeting and then say, you know what, you guys seem to care a lot, let's get rid of the soda.
Sure. I mean, I don't dispute that extremists can be spectacularly obnoxious. Of course, they can also be celebrated as, moral visionaries who attempted to make change before it was popular. But they can be incredibly nettlesome. That's a separate debate, which would be a very interesting one. But the debate here is it pluralistic ignorance that's driving the behavior, the self-censoring? And I don't think it is. And I think we can use this example.
You don't think it is at all?
No.
You don't think it's
I think it is somewhat, but I don't think it would matter much either way. And I think we can use this example of the faculty meeting to illustrate the point, because we can imagine a case in which the person has no ignorance. The person's fully aware that 90% of people agree with him or her, and that only 10% disagree. And yet it would be rational not to make the point, because the 10% really, really, really care, and the 90% don't care that much.
But who's more likely to say something? The person who thinks 80% of the people are on the side of the 4 who are screaming at the top of their lungs, or someone who knows it's just these 4 and everyone else agrees with me? Like, who's more likely to push back and say, hey, let's consider what more people think than just you 4?
Right, I agree. So to be clear, I'm not saying that pluralistic ignorance plays zero causal role in this situation. Maybe it's 5% of the cause. I'm just saying it's not the predominant cause. It's not that important. And
I think it's definitely bigger than 5%. I don't know what percent I would put on it though. But I do think in terms of getting people to push back against what I see as the direction the behavioral sciences are headed in, which is further toward the let's regulate scientific conclusions that we don't like, that don't support our social justice agenda. That science is done. Here are the truths that we want to elevate. I see it headed that way in the future, even more than it is now. And in terms of things that could prevent that from happening, I think shining light on the fact that it is a vocal minority is probably one of our best chances for, swinging things back the other direction.
I think
what else would
it
work?
is trying to persuade people that
because that's been going so well.
No, I don't think anything will work. But I think if we're looking at the menu of bad meals, as it were,
I actually do. The other thing I think is if they become more extreme, their vocal minority will shrink because it's getting too far.
Yeah, possibly.
They'll lose more support, but that's related to what I'm proposing
The way to think of it is we're in an atrocious restaurant. We made a bad decision on the way to the restaurant, and now we're there, and we have a menu of bad meals. And the question is, which is the least bad meal? My view is the least bad
French fries
is always go for the potatoes. My view is the least bad is to attempt to persuade some people who are currently in that 10% or 20% of the ardent minority that they're wrong to be in that group. Now, I don't know how efficacious that would be, but look, just to make this clear, I think
if we can get that 10% to turn
8%.
On each other.
Right, exactly. That's
which
right. Or if we can shrink it from 10% to 6%, right? Yeah. Maybe that would have a significant effect. But just to
but I think even like if people knew that the majority of people were against these people, then it would make it more costly for them. At least for them to know it's socially costly if it's not institutional, like it's not going to harm their career. These people don't know how much people dislike them.
Let me take it. Here's a concrete example. So so what we're talking about are incentives of reputational incentives, social incentives, likes, dislikes. Let's turn it into monetary incentives just to make it very clear. So let's suppose that, again, we're in this faculty meeting, and that if you say this thing, 90% of people will give you a quarter because they like it, and they're like, here's a quarter. Good for you for saying that. So 90% of people will give you a quarter, but 10% of people will beat you and take $10 from you, right? So 90%, they give you the quarters, 10%, each of them take $10 from you. Now you can see that the incentive, even though most people agree with you, and even if you knew most people would agree with you, so much so, in fact, that they would give you a quarter and say, good job, sport. It's still irrational to actually make that claim.
But again, because people don't know what the majority think, they don't know how much they're being hated. Like they think, well, I started this petition.
Wait, let's stop here though. Okay, stop. I agree with you. Hold on just for a second. You can go on that and I'm happy to listen to it, but let's just stop. I just want to make it clear that in my hypothetical example, would you agree that even if you're not pluralistically ignorant, it's perfectly rational not to do what the majority agrees with?
I agree that it can be rational.
That's all
not
I
to
wanted.
Do what the
that's all I want to point out. Now, say what you're going to say.
I was going to say, I think the pluralistic ignorance makes it so people don't see the costs to their behavior.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
So I'm saying, like, let's say I try to get the scholar fired, I start a petition, I gain a lot of status in my group of 10% of people because I led the charge on this important issue. I get the person fired, I won the day. What I don't see is 70% of my peers now hate me with a fiery passion. And that's a social cost I am paying, but I have no idea I'm paying it because these people aren't telling me they hate me. They're just sitting there going, I hope she doesn't come for me next.
I just think okay, so to be fair,
maybe 70% is an exaggeration.
Yeah, I get your point.
Whatever.
Okay, so
a chunk you would care about of your peers hating you.
Right, but your argument relies upon an incredibly stupid social animal, because what you're saying is people are actually really bad at knowing what will happen to them socially if they say X, Y, or Z.
Not always, but in an environment where a lot of people are self-censoring, yes. And a lot of people are self-censoring.
So you're saying, like, to be clear in this to make this more concrete in this payment example, what you're saying is people think that they won't have to pay a price for doing this, but in fact they are paying a big price. It's just a private price because there are people who think, John, I'm trying to think of a name that doesn't refer to an actual specific individual. So let's just say Dr. Smith. So actually privately, a bunch of people are like, Dr. Smith's an asshole. He's a self-righteous, smug asshole, and I don't like him. And what you're saying is, well, Dr. Smith doesn't know how many people think that. All he sees are the woke people who are celebrating him. And therefore, okay, but one thing is, isn't that true for most of us? That is to say, like, a lot of people have opinions about us. And we don't know what they are. And
I know.
Okay.
I know a lot of people hate me.
Right. I know a lot of people.
I know what percentage. I just assume everyone hates me until they tell me otherwise.
I just don't think, I think it's perfectly rational not to, if you're Dr. Smith and you went on this quasi jihad against a professor who was promoting research that you thought was not only wrong, but immoral and beyond the pale. And a lot of people privately think you're kind of a jerkweed, but publicly you get a lot of support and reward for it. And in fact, your institution rewards you for it, or at least it doesn't punish you for it. I don't think that's irrational.
I'm not saying it's irrational. I'm saying, I'm saying that revealing the genuine preferences and beliefs of academics changes the calculus for these people, or it should anyway. You don't want to lose the respect of 40% of your colleagues, or assume most people don't. And even if you don't know that that's happening, you wouldn't want it to happen. But once you do know it's happening, that changes your cost-benefit analysis.
If what you're saying is true, then why is it the case that academic institutions are becoming more and more woke, and that more and more woke people are winning prestigious positions at them?
Because everyone is scared of the vocal
minority. But a lot of these votes are private. These votes are not public votes.
No, the outcomes are never private. People publicly
No. I didn't say the outcome. Obviously, that, like, almost by definition, the outcomes are public. I'm saying the votes are private. When you vote,
give me like an example.
So, like, who's winning president of SPSP, for example?
We will see. I don't know.
Okay, right, but who's winning prestigious awards for research, for early career research, etc.?
Well, I don't know that there are any. I don't know that there are any. I mean, the president of SPSP, for example, is a public vote. I don't think the awards are. I think the awards are a small panel of people. So you're not going to see the majority opinion in those kinds of things. You will see. With, for example, SPSP, but like your choices, I mean, different societies have different choices every year, but often you're choosing between like a woke person and a woker person.
Okay, well, here's a concrete example though. Reviewers are private.
Yeah.
Why is it that
not really. The editor sees what you say.
Oh, okay, so the editor sees it, but it's private in that, like the rest of the psychology or the academic community does not see it. Why is it the case that it is so hard to get an article that violates these taboos through the review process?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I would say that people are probably still scared of what would happen if people found out that they were a reviewer on a paper that got published, which isn't beyond question that could happen. I mean,
yeah, that's fair.
Even
I'm
might
skeptical, but that's a fair
confess at some point.
Right.
It was me. Yeah, and the editors actually are always public. So if this paper gets published and the editor is the only one really who has the final call, the reviewers could say this paper has these flaws because all papers have flaws. And the editor says these flaws are devastating because the editor's name would go on the article. I don't know if all journals publish the editor's name on the article, but I do think it's probably the most of the time that's true.
Sure. No, I agree with.
That's not to say I haven't had plenty of hostile
Right.
reviewers.
That's what
I
I'm
have.
saying is like, I think most of the time these articles are quashed. It's by the reviewers, not by the editor. I mean, I'm sure there are cases in which the editor exercises his or her discretion and quashes it.
Yeah, I mean, I
Or
agree with you
rejects
that
it.
that's a good point, though. Like, the reviewers at least shouldn't feel,
Right.
they should mostly reveal their genuinely held
Yeah.
preferences.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. I
I
don't think that completely undercuts what I'm saying, but and I mean, it's hard too, because most people who, I guess most people who don't support academic freedom, according to like my definition of it,
Mhm.
probably a lot of them would say that they do.
That's right. That's right.
Because people are very good at coming up with scientific justifications for why research they dislike shouldn't be published. So
Right. So what they
they're
would
rarely
say,
saying like, this paper should never see the light of day because I don't like it and it violates my political views. They say because it used a convenient sample and it only looked at
or
this one measure of the thing. It didn't define this variable in the way
right.
they should have.
Right. No, what they would say is, well, look, we, in the same way that we don't need creationist biologists,
Yeah.
we don't need racist psychologists, right? So they would say, like, of course I support academic freedom for ideas that are even remotely plausible. For these other hateful ideas that have been rejected for 50 to 100 years, yeah, we shouldn't pursue that.
But I do think there's something interesting happening there, because I mean, depending on what idea we're talking about, there would be an assumption that everyone who knows what they're talking about agrees with me.
Yes, but
And on most of these taboo issues, or I shouldn't say, I say on at least of the ones that I've been looking at, there isn't much consensus around what is true and what is false. So to assert that this is scientific quackery and everyone's agrees that this is bullshit and has for decades,
right.
a lot of the time people are wrong. They're assuming other people believe what they believe. And
right,
the solution to that is showing that not everyone believes what they believe.
Right, but to be clear about that, that's just a sort of intrinsic human bias. Humans tend to think that more people feel the same way they do.
Yeah.
Right. So that, does that explain some human behavior? Maybe. I'm pretty skeptical of that. I think human social behavior tends to be pretty rational when you think in terms of real incentives. Now, I agree with you.
But I would say rational with the information they have available to them at the time.
Oh, I agree with that.
And I'm suggesting they are missing an important piece of information.
Right. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. And it's clearly the case that, for example, dictators and authoritarian regimes work really hard to create pluralistic ignorance. But I also think that if you look at the literature, say even on Joseph Stalin, one of the things that modern scholars have found is that a lot more people actively supported the regime and collaborated with it, or at least supported its goals, than maybe was previously assumed, and that a lot of other people just didn't care. Their life
how many
wasn't
people
that
supported
bad.
Out of fear?
Right. No, that's the
I'm not saying that,
right?
Not saying in some sense it almost doesn't matter how many supported out of fear.
Sure.
And how many were true believers. Although, I mean, I think it does matter. And it matters if people knew that. Like, if I knew other people supporting a cause that I don't actually support, but I support, like if I knew they didn't support it too, that would potentially embolden me to stop supporting it.
Right, but I think about this, like, suppose that you live in a city during the reign of Stalin, and suppose that you knew 80% of the people in the city actually kind of disliked Stalinism. Would that change your behavior? And my answer is probably not, because even though those 80% might not like Stalinism, and I'm not saying academia is equivalent to Stalinism, I'm just using this as an analogy, and actually it sort of makes my case even more so. If you knew 80% of people kind of disliked Stalin and Stalinism, so long as that didn't actually change the way the 20% behaved and the behavior of the regime itself, it would be idiotic, right?
If it changed the way the 80% behaved, if
right, that's what
awareness
but
of
it
the
might not.
80%, it might not, but that's
Right,
what I'm saying. It's a collective action problem. Like, step one, let people know what the majority thinks on the issue.
mm-hmm,
And then step two is, once the majority knows that they're in the majority,
mm-hmm.
now they have a new level of power that they could act on if they wanted to, so long as they do it together and it's not, a handful of people stepping forward and getting, slaughtered immediately. In
You go
academia, and
ahead.
just getting
Right,
just
but what I'm saying,
taking
and
some heat.
what all of my examples are attempting to get at, I think, is whatever the case actually is, it's not difficult to imagine plenty of scenarios in which 80% of people feel a certain way, and they all know they feel a certain way, and it still doesn't determine institutional behavior.
Yeah,
Because
that's possible, but it's not the only outcome.
no, I know, but so you agree with me that it's empirically possible. So then the question is just, what is actually happening in academia, right? You agree with that. So that's the question. It's not like my hypothesis is perfectly plausible.
What is your hypothesis?
My hypothesis is it wouldn't change behavior very much if professors knew the beliefs of other professors, because that's not what right, but I'm making a hypothesis of what we shall see, which is that it won't do much, because the I don't know what percentage it is, 60%, 80%, whatever, they don't care as much.
I would guess, if I had to pick a side, I would guess it probably wouldn't do much, but I think it's possible it would. But yeah, we'll see.
It's better than nothing, right? I agree with that.
Probably better than nothing.
Probably, yeah. And I think we should do it, and we should promote it. And I do think it's telling, again, that regimes often attempt to create pluralistic ignorance that suggests that there's an advantage to a minority to promote pluralistic ignorance.
And that having people realize what the majority believes is a threat to the minority.
Exactly. I mean, there's a reason there's the sort of phrase divide and conquer, right? The thing you want to do is you create these divisions and doubts among people, and then they're easier to control or conquer or whatever. Totally agree with that. I just am skeptical that that's the major causal pattern that is occurring in academia right now. I don't think that is.
I don't know if it's the primary one. I think it is one of the main ones anyway. But we've been going on for a while.
Yeah, well, how long is it supposed to be?
I don't think we have a target.